It happened in an instant. One moment, Ethan was pedaling down the familiar stretch of road, the wind cool against his face, the sky a golden hue as the sun dipped low. The next, a sudden burst of blinding headlights, a deafening screech of tires, a hollow, sickening thud. Then silence. Everything slowed. The world tilted, flipped. He was weightless, floating, yet there was no sensation of pain. No sound, no breath, just stillness. Ethan tried to move, but his limbs were no longer his own. The road, the trees, his crushed bicycle, they all seemed to fade, swallowed by a creeping darkness that spread like ink in water. Then came the ringing, a deep, pulsing hum, growing louder, sharper, drilling into his skull until it drowned out everything. Then, nothing. His eyes fluttered open, but he wasn't on the road anymore. He wasn't anywhere. Ethan stood in a vast, endless space. A space with no walls, no ground, no sky. Just an infinite expanse of soft, glowing mist stretching in every direction. The air was thick, yet impossibly light. He felt no weight, no exhaustion, no fear. Just a strange sense of peace. Somewhere in the distance, a faint light pulsed. It was warm, inviting, beckoning him forward with an almost magnetic pull. Ethan hesitated. Something about it felt right, like stepping into the arms of someone he had always known but never met. He took a step, then another. And with each step, the mist around him grew thinner, revealing glimpses of shapes, shifting shadows, and echoes of voices, whispers too soft to understand. Then he felt it, a presence. It was unlike anything he had ever known. Powerful, immense, and yet gentle. It didn't just exist near him. It was around him, inside him. Every fiber of his being recognized it before his mind could catch up. This presence knew him, completely, utterly. Every thought, every fear, every secret buried in his heart. He didn't need to see it to understand what it was. A single word formed in Ethan's mind, though his lips never moved. Jesus. A wave of warmth surged through him, not like heat, but like love. Pure, unconditional, overwhelming. It filled every inch of his soul, washing over him like an ocean tide. For the first time, he realized something strange. He wasn't afraid. He should have been. He knew something unnatural was happening, something far beyond his comprehension. Yet here, in this presence, there was no fear. Only clarity. But then, as quickly as the warmth came, it shifted. Sorrow. A deep, aching sorrow. Ethan didn't know how, but he felt it. Jesus' sorrow. It was not just sadness, it was grief. A burden so heavy it made the very air tremble. The light around them dimmed, flickering like a candle in the wind. Something was wrong. Ethan's lips parted, but before he could speak, the space around him rippled. The mist pulled away like a curtain, revealing something else. A vision. Something real. Something happening in that very moment. He wasn't ready for what he saw. The warmth faded. The light dimmed. The weight of something unseen pressed down on Ethan's chest, making it hard to breathe, if he was even breathing at all. The peaceful glow around him flickered, twisted, then shattered like glass, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. The air was thick with smoke. A city stood before him, its skyline burning. Buildings crumbled as fire rained from the sky, the streets below filled with terrified screams. Cars lay overturned, their frames twisted and scorched. Bodies, motionless figures scattered among the rubble, blurred in his vision. A dull, rhythmic sound rumbled beneath it all, like distant thunder, but as it grew louder, Ethan recognized it for what it was. Explosions. His heart pounded. This wasn't some nightmare. This felt real. more real than anything he had ever known. He could smell the ash. He could hear the cries. A child ran past him, barely older than himself. A girl with dirt-streaked skin and wide, tear-filled eyes. She was screaming for someone, her mother maybe, but the voice was drowned by the roar of an approaching aircraft. Ethan followed her gaze just in time to see a massive shape overhead. A jet. It swooped down, releasing something that whistled through the air before striking the ground in a violent, deafening explosion. The shockwave sent a burst of wind through the streets, scattering debris and flame. The girl was gone. Ethan tried to move, to run, but he wasn't truly there. He had no body, no voice. He was an observer, forced to witness the horrors unfolding before him. He turned his head, desperate to look away, but there was nowhere to look. Everywhere was the same. Burning cities, endless destruction. Then, his surroundings shifted again. The war-ravaged streets faded, replaced by a room, dimly lit, cold, filled with the weight of something unseen. A long table stood at the center, surrounded by men. At first, Ethan didn't recognize them. They were talking, debating, their voices sharp, urgent. Some were angry, others defensive. Then he saw him. Trump. He was sitting at the table, speaking, his expression unreadable. To his right, another man leaned forward, frustration clear on his face. Zelensky. Across from them, J.D. Vance spoke with authority, his words deliberate. Ethan couldn't make out every sentence, but fragments of their conversation pierced through the haze. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. Your country is in big trouble. The words cut through the air like blades. Tension hung thick between them, and Ethan could feel it, something teetering on the edge. They weren't just talking. They were standing at a precipice, and one wrong step could send everything into the abyss. Ethan's pulse quickened. He could sense it now, the connection. The war he had just seen, the cities in ruin, the screams, the fire. This conversation was the spark. The men in the room didn't see what he had seen. They didn't know what was at stake. The scene around him flickered, warping like a mirage. Jesus was beside him again, his expression solemn. Ethan turned to him, desperate for answers. They do not understand, Jesus said softly. They do not see what is coming. Ethan's voice caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to warn them, to shake these men until they listened. But he couldn't. They think they are in control, Jesus continued, his eyes filled with sorrow. But they are blind, and the world stands on the edge of fire. Ethan turned back to the table where the argument continued. Words like ceasefire, destruction, power, and negotiation bounced between them. He wanted to believe they would make the right choice, that someone would see the truth. But deep in his gut, he knew they wouldn't. The vision cracked. The world around him trembled. And then, everything collapsed. Ethan fell. The ground beneath him no longer existed. He plunged through darkness, through nothingness, through something heavier than air itself. A weight pulled at him, dragging him downward. Though there was no up or down, no sense of direction, only a terrifying, endless descent. The cold bit into him, seeping into his bones. But the deeper he fell, the more he realized. It wasn't just cold. It was something worse. It was despair. It clung to him like invisible chains, wrapping around his limbs, squeezing the breath from his lungs, even though he no longer needed to breathe. It was in his mind, whispering, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, filling him with a sorrow so deep it felt as if it would consume him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Ethan was standing again. Or was he? The world around him was not the world he knew. The sky was cracked. not just dark, cracked, like shattered glass barely holding together. Through the jagged fractures he could see things, flashes of war, of suffering, of people crying out in terror, cities burning, families torn apart. The images flickered like dying light bulbs, vanishing before he could fully comprehend them, only to be replaced by something worse. Beneath him stretched a barren wasteland. It was not Earth. It was not anywhere he had ever seen before. The ground was scorched black, charred as if fire had consumed it over and over again. The air smelled of ash and something acrid, something rotten. In the distance, massive figures stood, barely visible through the thick haze. They loomed like shadows, their forms shifting unnaturally. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel them watching him, waiting. And then, there he was. Jesus. Ethan turned, expecting to see the same warmth in his eyes, the same overwhelming peace as before. But this time, there was no peace. There was grief. Jesus stood motionless, his white robe streaked with something dark, his face heavy with sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable to look at. His eyes, once filled with kindness, were now filled with something else. A warning. "They are playing with fire," Jesus said softly, his voice carrying through the dead air like a whisper from eternity itself. Ethan felt his body tense. He didn't need to ask who they were. Jesus lifted a hand, and suddenly, Ethan was no longer in the wasteland. He was back in the vision. The world was burning. But this time, it wasn't just cities. It was everything. The sky was an angry shade of red, thick clouds rolling in like a storm. The air shimmered, distorted by the heat radiating from the earth itself. Skyscrapers had collapsed into smoldering heaps. Rivers boiled. The ground cracked open in jagged wounds, swallowing entire streets whole. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw them. The people, they were screaming, running, but there was nowhere to go. Some clawed at the ground, as if trying to dig their way to safety. Others reached toward the sky, their faces contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent cries of despair. Their skin was peeling, their eyes wide with terror, and above them, the sky tore apart. A blinding light erupted from the heavens, swallowing everything in its path. Ethan felt the shockwave before he heard it. The blast ripped through the landscape, flattening everything in its way, consuming buildings, streets, entire mountains in an instant. And then, nothing. Silence. The world was gone. Ethan stood alone in an endless void, his body trembling. He turned to Jesus, his voice barely a whisper. What was that?" Jesus' expression didn't change. "The path they are on." Ethan shook his head. No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't let this happen." Jesus didn't answer. Instead, the vision shifted again. Ethan saw the men sitting around the table. He saw Trump, Zelensky, J.D. Vance, all of them, still arguing, still debating, still thinking they had control. They had no idea what was at stake. They thought it was about power, about politics. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see this. Jesus turned to Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "They do not understand." Ethan clenched his fists. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone had to tell them. Someone had to make them listen, before it was too late. Pain. Searing, unbearable pain. Ethan's body jerked as if being yanked by an unseen force, and suddenly he was falling again. But this time, it was different. This time, there was weight. His chest ached, his skin burned, and his ears were filled with an unbearable ringing. His body slammed into something hard, and a desperate gasp tore from his lips. His lungs filled, a rush of air so sharp it felt like knives slicing through his chest. The pain doubled, his nerves screaming in protest. A distant, muffled voice shouted something. He couldn't understand the words. He couldn't understand anything. His eyes flew open, and bright white light pierced his vision. Shapes loomed over him. People. Machines. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. Panic surged through him. Where was he? What was happening? Then, memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. The road, the car, the impact, the falling. And then, Jesus. The vision, the fire, the men at the table. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as the weight of it all came rushing back. He remembered every detail, every word, every desperate scream of the people in the burning streets. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some fevered hallucination. It was real. More real than anything he had ever known. He had seen what was coming. And now, he was back. "Ethan!" A voice broke through the haze, trembling and thick with emotion. His mother. She was crying. He turned his head slightly. Every movement sent sharp stabs of pain through his skull. His mother's face hovered above him, her eyes red and swollen. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, my baby, you're awake." Ethan wanted to tell her what he had seen. He wanted to tell everyone. But his lips wouldn't form the words. His throat was dry, raw, like he had swallowed fire. He blinked, trying to focus, but the room around him spun. He could barely breathe. Doctors rushed in. Hands pressed against his body, checking tubes, flashing lights, muttering things he couldn't process. He tried to sit up, but the pain forced him back down. He wasn't ready. Not yet. But the knowledge burned inside him like an ember waiting to ignite. Days passed. Ethan lay in the hospital, replaying every moment of what he had seen. He barely spoke. He barely slept. He could hear the doctors talking in hushed voices. Something about a miracle, about how he shouldn't have survived the impact, how his injuries were severe but not nearly as bad as they should have been. His mother called it a blessing. The doctors called it luck. But Ethan knew better. It wasn't luck. It was a warning. And the world had no idea how close it was to the edge. The first time he turned on the television, his stomach dropped. The news was everywhere. Footage of world leaders, of political debates, of rising tensions that no one seemed to be taking seriously enough. And then, the conversation. It was there, on the screen. The same conversation he had seen while he was in the vision. Trump, Zelensky, J.D. Vance. Word for word. The same arguments, the same tension. It had just happened. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was all real. He had overheard something no living person should have been able to hear. He had witnessed something that had yet to unfold. And he knew deep in his bones that this was only the beginning. The war wasn't just coming. It had already begun. And if they didn't change course, if the men at that table didn't see the truth, didn't realize the consequences of their decisions, then the world he had seen in that vision, the fire, the screaming, the end of everything, would become reality. Ethan closed his eyes, his heart racing. He had been sent back for a reason. He had been chosen to warn them. But would anyone listen before it was too late?